Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time you are watching this. This is another day the Lord has made. Sorry, for us to rejoice and be glad in it. Karibuni sana. I again hope and pray that you are doing well today, wherever you are and whatever you are up to. God has kept you safe and sound to this point in time. We continue on with the story of Esther. Again, I hope you guys have been learning and been taking time to just dig deeper into the story of Esther, a very interesting historical book that teaches us about a lot about the history of the children of Israel when they were in captivity in Persia, what they were going through. But more so, we get to see what God does and what God did continue to do in the lives of the children of Israel as they were away from their home. And today I want us to just continue looking into this story. I want us to look at chapter 4 of the book of Esther. Again, chapter 4 is another very interesting chapter. Previously, we looked at chapter 3 when the decree was passed and Haman was given the permission to destroy all the Jews. And now I want us to see what the reaction from Mordecai and Esther was when they received this news. And so chapter 4 starts when Mordecai has learned about what was happening and what was about to happen, and he goes into a state of mourning. And if you know anything about the mourning the children of Israel or the Jews used to do, was very dramatic in nature. They would get put on sackcloths, they would get ashes, and they would cry and they would cry. It's like a kid who's throwing a tantrum and is rolling in the mud, rolling in the sand, rolling in the soil, and they would cry. And so he's in that state. He's mourning, he's crying, and he's not just mourning for the sake of mourning. He's mourning because they, the Israelites, were going to be destroyed. And it was a sad thing to imagine that in 12 months' time, you and all of your people are going to be annihilated. And so that's what Mordecai does. And later on, Esther receives news about Mordecai's state, and she is saddened. Of course, this is your cousin. You've had his mourning. You are saddened, and she sends one of the guys who was attached to her, a eunuch called Hathach. Actually, it's Hathatha. These names are hard. Hathach, to find out what the issue was. So Hathach talks to Mordecai, and Mordecai tells him and shares a copy of the edict gives it to him and tells him everything, basically that the law had been passed and that in 12 months' time the Jews are going to be annihilated. And number two, Mordecai sends Hathach requesting that Esther go to the king's presence to beg him for mercy and to plead for her people. So Mordecai is wise in terms of he's not just mourning, but he knows that a solution can be found if Esther goes to the king. This is the king, this is the husband. And at this point, honestly, King Xerxes doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. And I wonder, of course, how will you be married to somebody and you do not know the ethnicity? But again, it was kept wraps because as initially we read in chapter 2, Mordecai told that Esther that it was wise if she did not say that she was a Jew. So again, the guy, the husband, Xerxes' husband to Queen Esther, doesn't know about this. And so Hathach reports back to Esther, and then now Esther is given the words that Mordecai had given her. And I want us to just look at chapter 4 verse 13. So we're told that Hathach went back to Esther and gave her this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. So basically he's telling her, this is Mordecai telling Esther, do not think just because you're a Jew in the house of the king, you'll be spared. Just know for sure, that whatever happens, you also may end up being killed. Very sad. Then he goes on to say, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. This is one of the most famous and common verses derived from the book of Esther. That is chapter 4, verse 14 that talks about, again, I'm going to read it verbatim. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. Basically, what Mordecai is telling Esther was, do not think that you are being a queen is just for the sake of being a queen. God knew why he had to make you a queen for such a time as this. And again, that calls us to think about the positions God has put us in. Sometimes you may just think it's about you, but truth of the matter is, the places you are in, it's not really about ourselves. It's about the glory of God and about all those who God has put us there for that purpose. It can be our families, it can be our communities, it can be our country. So whenever you're in a position, never take it for granted that you are there. Always know that God has a reason. And if you look at the story of Esther, I want us to backtrack a bit and see how these words, yes, are said to her, but indeed, do they make sense? And let me just take us back to the 11th verse of that story that says, and this is what it says: all the king's official and the people of the royal provinces know that any man and woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, by the king, has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So here is Mordecai telling Esther that you need to do something. But Esther's predicament is, I haven't been in the presence of this king for 30 days. Basically, I haven't been called to his presence for 30 days. And the law was, no one was to just come in without being called. So basically, you couldn't take yourself to the king unless he called you. Again, remember, we are dealing with a guy who he's high on power. You remember the first verse of Esther. This king Xerxes is high on power. He is drunk on power. He is the king, the ruler of the superpower of the world at that point in time. Basically, you can't tell him anything. But again, we see Esther here, for one reason or another, it's a discussion that they have, that God put you in a position for a time like this, but the reality is, I have not been called to the presence of the king, rather, for a very long time. And if I take myself there, it's either I die, or, to some extent, he extends his golden scepter to me, and I am given audience in his presence. For you to approach the king in the inner court, one had to have been summoned by the king. If not, you will die. So the only exemption is that the king will have, again, as I said, to extend his golden scepter to you and spare your life. And 30 days had passed since Esther had been called to the presence of the king. If you compare this with what had happened to Queen Vashti, you will realize you are not dealing with somebody who is heavy. In fact, if you use the example and the instance of Queen Vashti as a president, you know that this king is a no-nonsense king. In fact, if anything, if Esther was to approach and Esther was to say whatever she wanted to say, and the king was like, no, I don't want your presence, she will be banished. In short, even worse than happened to Vashti, she would be killed. She will be put to death. And the king has already shown us that he's not phased to do away with people around him, clearly. And so this is the predicament Esther is at. But what I like about it is, and it points us to this, are we ready to take risks for the things that matter to God? Are we ready to take risks for the things that matter to God? Here in this story, it is about the nation of Israel, the people of God who are in danger. And the one person who is in a position, as Mordecai reminded her in the 14th verse of the 4th chapter, was Esther. Because no one knows, maybe she came into a position or royal position for such a time like this. Again, I remember saying this in the first chapter, that nothing finds God by surprise. Even that fact that Queen Vashti went, and it tells us in the first chapter that now there was a position for another one to come in. God knew what he was orchestrating. God knew how these things were going to work out, because he's a God who knows. We said he knows beginning from the end, so he knew. And at this point in time, Esther is being told, hey, out of all these people, you are the only one who can save us. And so my question to you is, are you willing to take risks for the glory of God? Are you willing to take risks that are beyond your handling, beyond your capacity, for the glory of God? We are yet to see what Esther did. But up to this point, she is contemplating. Yes, Mordecai has told me this, and this is the thing that is at hand. If I go to his presence and I have not been summoned, it's either I am killed, or at the very bare minimum, he extends his gold scepter to me and he allows me audience in his presence. And the second thing I see, which is in the last 2 verses, rather 3 verses. So Esther decided to send a reply to Mordecai. So she thought about it, and this is what she said. In verse 16, it says, "Go, gather together all Jews who are in Susa and fast for me." Basically, pray for me. Again, remember, we haven't seen anything about God, but of course, these guys are not praying and fasting just for the sake of praying and fasting. It's not kujinyima food. It's not a hunger strike, but they are praying and fasting to Yahweh, their God. Do not, verse 16 goes on to say, "Do not eat or drink for 3 days, for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law." Remember, she is about to take a risk for the glory of God. And then it says, "And if I perish, I perish." So basically, this is what Esther is saying. This is what is at hand. My people are about to die. They're about to be annihilated. I am the only one of all Jews to exist in the world at that point in time who is in a position to save them. But my doing that basically means I have to play around with death. The fact that I can die. It's not even like Queen Vashti's position where I can be banished. It's the fact that I can die. And again, are we willing to take risks for the things that matter to God, for the glory of God? Or is it that you're presented with such things and your first thing is to cower and to run away? I also need to ask myself that question, because it's easier said than done. But like Esther, she was willing to take the risk. But not only take the risk, but pray about it. Welcome God into that space. It's very easy for us to do things because we think they are right to do. But it is another thing for us to do them from a point of even welcoming God to go before us. As Moses said in Exodus 33, that if your presence does not go before us, then do not allow us to depart from this place. And so those are my 2 takeouts and my 2 encouragements for us today. May we be willing to take risks for the glory of God, number 1. And number 2, may we be willing to pray and ask God to go before us as we do the things that are right and are for the glory of God. Even as you take these risks, allow God to go before you. Ultimately, He knows everything. So that's our reflection on chapter 4. See you next time as we look at chapter 5. Thanks and be blessed.